Okay, so recently Capcom had their financial meetings and it showed us a lot of information. One, Resident Evil and Monster Hunter are as popular as ever. And two, Capcom is probably never going to go back to making the large variety of games that they used to make, considering how much money they are making. But there's something else that I wanted to talk to, because I think that when it comes to Japanese RPGs, Japanese style games, one name is synonymous with RPGs out there when it comes to worldwide appeal, and that is Final Fantasy. So I was looking over the sales numbers for Capcom and what they've been able to do with the Monster Hunter brand over the past 20 years or so. And I was also looking recently at the news of Final Fantasy 15 selling 10 million copies now after how many years? I think it's been like 6 years or so. And then I was also looking at the sales of Monster Hunter Rise on the Nintendo Switch and PC and saw that that is over 9 million units, with a large majority, at least minimum 8 point something million on the Nintendo Switch itself in about a year plus or so. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, what happened here? Final Fantasy had always been more popular than Monster Hunter. Final Fantasy 15, huge, massive release on Xbox, PlayStation, backwards compatible, PC, everything. Monster Hunter Rise just recently launched, not too long ago, on one platform, the Nintendo Switch, with a far smaller install base, and is already almost up there with a mainline Final Fantasy entry. So that has me thinking, is Square Enix botching or mishandling the Final Fantasy brand? But before we do, what's good everyone? OJ here. Welcome back to another video. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, and click that notification bell to get my videos, RPG news, discussion, and live streams first. Now let's go ahead and get into this. Is the brand being mishandled? Are there issues with it? And I would say yes and no. I think that it's a multifaceted thing. One, let's just say this right now, Final Fantasy 14 is doing absolutely incredible. Yoshi P and the crew over there at Square Enix have done a phenomenal job at giving the fans what they want with that game and with that particular style, the MMO. So you can't really knock the turnaround. Now, it did take some time because at first it failed, but they got the right guy in there to right the ship. And now at this point, things are going very, very well for Final Fantasy 14. However, as good as that's been, there's been the other side, and that is the console level Final Fantasy games. And yes, 10 million units for Final Fantasy 15 is great. I don't want to downplay their success, but it's been after how many years now? What, 6 years going or something like that? And on all the different platforms. And let's keep it a buck here, guys. They're selling that game like at $9 to $15. I bought the Royal Edition on Xbox One for $14.99 a number of years ago. I did buy the game originally at launch, day one edition on the Xbox One, and there was issues with the game at launch. Now, this is not the first time that Square Enix has somewhat botched a launch of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 13-2, Lightning Returns, there was issues there as well. Now, Final Fantasy 7 Remake was great, but there were some issues in terms of what people felt about the direction of the game. So there really hasn't been a lot of stability like we've seen the stability of Monster Hunter over the past number of years. And I personally feel that that instability in Final Fantasy gave Monster Hunter, Capcom, the opportunity to supplant Final Fantasy and do that in a very big way. I think Japanese gamers were ready to go all in on the high definition Final Fantasy games if they were able to actually deliver what gamers wanted, but they weren't. So that gave Monster Hunter, a franchise that was never anywhere near as big as Final Fantasy before. It was able to leapfrog it because the latest numbers are 20 million plus, almost 30 million, or going on 30 million for Monster Hunter World plus the Iceborne DLC. And if you count in Monster Hunter Rise, it's well over 30 million combined, and that's just within the past number of years. Monster Hunter World came out, I think, 2018? So over the past 4 years now, they're selling 30 million plus of content of Monster Hunter, whereas with Final Fantasy and their mainline console games, they're not even coming close to that. So there's definitely an issue here. Once again, Final Fantasy 14 not included. That has been doing fantastic. But once again, that is more for a different crowd, not necessarily the people that want to play a single player RPG or an RPG that's built for the consoles, whereas Final Fantasy 14 is more built for the PCs and is also available on PlayStation. So I do want to just make sure that I make that separation here. So was there a mistake being made? Absolutely. I think that there's been multiple mistakes, and I think that one of the big mistakes that I think that Capcom saw very early and that Square Enix didn't. Square Enix saw the Nintendo Switch, that platform, as something like, yeah, we can do some stuff on it, but maybe it's not quite big enough or good enough for a huge Final Fantasy game, where they can take advantage of people who don't love the new direction of Final Fantasy, which there are, I think, millions of gamers who like the old school or more traditional Final Fantasy games, the Final Fantasy X, the Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9. I mean, those games do extremely well when it comes to the digital downloads and the physical releases of those games, or re-releases, I should say, on modern platforms. So I feel that there is a big contingent of fans who do want that. And I feel that Capcom saw that obviously Monster Hunter had done very well on Nintendo platforms before, but they were trying to build something a bit bigger. They made Monster Hunter World, but at the same time, they started planning Monster Hunter Rise on the Nintendo Switch as the platform matured and got more people to get on the system and got bigger install base, and they can put together the marketing plan and put together the RE engine for the Nintendo Switch. Square Enix never really took that next leap. Now, they did have Dragon Quest, don't get me wrong, but we're talking about their flagship big franchise, which has always been Final Fantasy for them. So the fact that we haven't seen from Square Enix a traditional big Final Fantasy custom built for the Nintendo Switch was a huge missed opportunity, especially if you're talking about it from the Japanese sides of things. I think that that was a huge missed opportunity, because look at how big the Nintendo Switch has gotten at this point. It surpassed the Nintendo 3DS in sales, and it's coming for the Nintendo DS next. So this is pretty impressive what it's doing, and you're not really staking your claim in that high-end RPG ground. Look at what Dragon Quest did. Heck, they had that for the Nintendo Switch. It did phenomenal on the platform, well over 1 million units in Japan by itself as a 2-year-old late port. And as great as Dragon Quest is, and we know how awesome and how great it is, and people love that, and yes, you're gonna get a big number of fans in Japan buying it, and worldwide as well. Dragon Quest did phenomenal in the West too. Imagine what a custom-built new Final Fantasy game in the same vein as Rise, considering how Rise did in Japan with the millions that it sold. I'm wondering exactly where Square Enix could have been financially, even a bit better at this point, and also looking at it from a gamer standpoint, to where you can provide what gamers want, not just what one side wants. Because I do think that, yes, going to action RPG was probably the right move if you want to get PlayStation and Xbox gamers to buy in heavily into Final Fantasy. So I'm not knocking their decision there. I'm not saying that they should force it on the Nintendo Switch. Definitely not saying that. What I'm saying is that they should have had enough confidence, probably back in 2018 or so, to start preparing and getting something ready for a major turn-based Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo Switch, custom built for it. Now, that's not to knock Square Enix's efforts. I think that Square Enix is one of the leading publishers, third-party publishers on the Nintendo Switch. They've made great stuff like Bravely Default and Triangle Strategy and Octopath Traveler and Trials of Mana and Dragon Quest XI. So they're very good, and Dragon Quest XI being the only truly big, I guess you can say, quote-unquote, AAA type of game that they've made. I just feel that for your flagship franchises, like a Dragon Quest or like a Final Fantasy. They should have had something ready very similar to how we've seen with Capcom and Monster Hunter Rise, and how they've been able to take the world by storm with that franchise. So I think that that's where that kind of happened, because let's just keep it real here, guys. Final Fantasy has no business taking how many years? Taking, 6 years to sell 10 million. There's obviously a love for this franchise. We see it with Final Fantasy 14 if they can make a solid game. But I think that they're also serving multiple types of audiences with Final Fantasy. And I think that in order to reach the true or full potential that Final Fantasy can do when it comes to a full franchise, I do feel that they need to kind of branch off just a little bit more. And no, not with mobile games or stuff like that. They need to make turn-based Final Fantasy again. They need to make sure that they do that, because I personally feel that a big AAA turn-based Final Fantasy game, it doesn't have to be Switch exclusive, but you can build it for the Switch and put it onto other platforms as well. I think that would do incredibly well. I think that could sell over 10 million units a lot faster than what a Final Fantasy 15 did. And yes, obviously Final Fantasy 15 did not have the best Metacritic score, did not have the best word of mouth, but I do feel that there are some Final Fantasy fans that aren't buying Final Fantasy because it's no longer turn-based. So even if the games that they come out new end up being really good, like Final Fantasy VII Remake, for example, you're not going to get 10 million units, or you're not going to get sales as fast as Monster Hunter, because there's always a contingent of fans that feel that turn-based Final Fantasy is better. So in my opinion, they should be satisfying those fans, and not only with pixel remasters or re-releases or Bravely Default or Octopath and saying, okay, well, go play those. Well, yeah, I get that, but those aren't Final Fantasy. There's a certain era and quality and level and name recognition that people like with Final Fantasy. Now, if you're a Final Fantasy fan, old school fan, obviously go out there and play those games. I get that. But I think that you still have a brand to uphold, and they could have multiple revenue streams. Now, I know it's not cheap to do something like this, but I feel that multiple revenue streams with the action RPG, Final Fantasy, get your PlayStation deals, Final Fantasy 16, whatever the case is, have your MMO Final Fantasy that people are loving with Final Fantasy 14 and whatever you decide to do next, and then also have your turn-based Final Fantasy for the old school fans, your AAA turn-based Final Fantasy. Not Bravely Default 2 and say, oh, well, yeah, that's Final Fantasy. It used to be Final Fantasy, but AAA, where you actually spend the type of money that you would spend on your action RPG or on something else, but giving those fans what they want. I think with that three-pronged approach there, I think that Final Fantasy can once again rise up to where it is just as high as Monster Hunter is at this point. So I was just kind of looking over everything, and it just kind of shocked me, the rise of Monster Hunter and how popular it's gotten in a shorter time period than we've ever seen. We'll see what happens going forward in the future. I think that Final Fantasy 16 is going to be awesome. I understand why Final Fantasy 16 is an exclusive or console exclusive for the PlayStation 5, and it's also coming to PC, but it's a console exclusive. I get that. Sony paid them a lot of money for that to be done. Obviously, you weren't going to put that on the Nintendo Switch, and there's still a PC version of that, so I completely get that. But I do feel that Square Enix does have the capital, they do have the manpower, and they should have the business acumen to actually look into what their fans want as well, based off of what people simply say, their sales of their action RPG Final Fantasy games, and also the rise of the Nintendo Switch. This type of conversation should have happened years ago, so we could be getting that major Final Fantasy game at this point as well, alongside a new Final Fantasy 16 or something like that. But those are just my opinions on the matter. What do you guys think about all of this? Let me know in the comment section below. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video here. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, and we will see you for the next video. Peace.